Hi, this is Aaron Newcomb, and on this episode of Floss Weekly, Dan Lynch joins me to talk to Denis Defreyne about Nanoc, which is a web publishing system based on Ruby. It does all kinds of cool things and publishes your website out in static HTML files. It's very interesting. You're not going to want to miss it. It's coming up next on Floss Weekly.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for Floss Weekly is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Floss Weekly with Aaron Newcomb and Dan Lynch, episode 207, recorded on April 11th, 2012. Nanoc. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies on your PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, Android device, or TV instantly, all streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. This is Floss Weekly, the show about free Libre open source software. It's always fun to be here again, sitting in for Randall, who's out on a cruise today. And sitting in with me today is Dan Lynch. Dan, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you? It's been a while since we've done a show together, I think.
Yeah, it has been a while, and I don't know why. I mean, it seems like I've co-hosted a bunch with Randall, but we haven't got the chance to sit in together. It's always a lot of fun. You always have a lot of great questions and comments, and we both do other podcasts as well. So it's kind of nice to sit in with someone who does this on a semi-regular basis as well.
Definitely.
So great. So just to get started today, I mentioned Randall's away, but we'll be covering Nanoc today. Nanoc is I will have to correct this, I'm sure, when we bring on our guest, but it's based on Ruby, and it's a kind of a web publishing system, not necessarily a framework, but a publishing system where you can draw on whatever your favorite editing tool of the day, or PHP, or different things. You can pull that in, create a static site apparently to publish to your servers. So it should be pretty interesting. Have you heard of Nanoc? I know you do some web publishing and various things. Have you heard of this before?
I've got to admit, I hadn't heard of it before I looked and started researching the show, but it's a really interesting tool. I mean, I've been reading up about it the last couple of days. It's this idea of compiling a website, which I hadn't really thought about, and it seems other people are already doing it. So maybe I should have thought about it sooner. It sounds interesting.
Yeah, it definitely does. There's certainly some performance benefits to be had if you're dealing with static sites. There's all this caching that happens on Google sites and all these other things, but static sites, certainly not having to draw on so much of the server resources, that's got to be a big factor in why this came about. But we'll find out in a few minutes when we talk to our guest. But first, let's talk about Netflix. I love Netflix because Netflix lets you stream thousands of TV episodes and movies directly to you instantly, which saves you time, money, and all importantly, hassle. There are several easy ways to access instantly streaming movies and TV shows with Netflix. You can watch on your TV or your MacBook or your PC, whatever you have. You can also watch on your iPhone or Android phone, which is how I've been doing it more and more lately, is on my Android phone. If you have a gaming console like Wii or an Xbox 360 or whatever, you can watch there too. So they make it really easy to actually find this, the content. You can even watch on a Roku box. It's another popular way that people watch. Very inexpensive way to get into something like Netflix without having to buy a gaming console if you're on the cheap or not into games. With Netflix, you can watch movies and TV shows instantly using any of those devices that I mentioned, and you can begin watching a movie or a show on one device and then finish on a different one. So whatever way you want to choose to access Netflix, you can watch as many movies and TV shows as you want, anytime you want, and once you sign up, you can cancel anytime. You can also get a free subscription by going to netflix.com/twit. You can get a 30-day free trial of Netflix, so be sure to use that URL when you sign up for your free trial. That's netflix.com/twit, and we thank Netflix for their support of the TWiT network and for their support of course, Floss Weekly. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on our guest, Denis Defreyne. Denis, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Denis, where are you calling in from or Skyping in from today?
I'm calling you in from Belgium, in Europe, on the countryside for a change.
Great. I've been in Belgium a couple of times for work, so mostly just in Brussels, but great place, great beer in Brussels, so here in Belgium.
Yeah, indeed.
Good stuff. So we're talking about Nanoc. Am I pronouncing it right?
I usually call it Nanoc, but it's fine, whatever you say.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure when I first started looking into this. I wasn't sure how to pronounce it. So give us the high-level overview. What is Nanoc?
Nanoc is a static site compiler or a generator, which means that you have a directory with your Markdown files or your HTML files or whatever it is, your JavaScripts, your CSS files, and then you type Nanoc compile, and then it generates HTML files, it transforms the Markdown files, it puts them in a layout, and it generates the generated HTML files then can be uploaded to a web host. So it's you end up with a static site, unlike traditional CMSs where you run the code on the server and you have a web interface for editing your site. So that's the very high-level overview of what Nanoc does.
Right. So the difference would be, for example, on my site, I'm running a Drupal on my site, which uses PHP. And so every time someone goes to my site, they hit the PHP. Now, there are some caching algorithms and things that go on, but basically they run that the PHP code gets run and it generates a page on the fly, so to speak. And there's a lot of variables and things that go on. But what this does is it actually generates a static page based on all of those other things that you've done already. And so every time the page loads, it's just the static page that comes up.
Yeah, indeed. And there's a few advantages to that. For example, it's much faster, and you can add caching layers to your PHP site, and that's all fine, but it takes memory, it adds complexity. It's also safer to use static HTML pages because there's no way to exploit that in the way PHP or Ruby or whatever is exploitable. You can use your favorite text editor too, so Emacs or Vim or whatever, which is very nice because the text editors that you find online, the web-based text editors, are usually not as nice. It's versionable. You can put your site in a Git repository and tag certain change sets when you publish your site and so on.
So why would I use this instead of using maybe a service? I'm just trying to think of the different use cases. So, maybe I'd rather use like Blogger or WordPress or something like that. Is this designed for those types of people, or is it really designed more for somebody running a business that's doing lots and lots of different pages?
Yeah, you can use Nanoc for small pages, personal websites, blogs, and so on, but it's aimed more at more complex sites, maybe a bit larger sites. If you want some custom code or you want some custom behavior in your site, then Nanoc is probably a good choice for you. So, for example, there's the Mist Online site, which I made, and it's multilingual. There's a couple of different languages, and the way Nanoc is used to build that site is really very natural. You wouldn't be able to do that with Blogger. You wouldn't be able to do that with any of the existing services.
And you said the Mist site? What's the URL for that?
mistonline.com.
Okay.
I no longer maintain it, but it's still up.
Okay. And is this Mist like the game Mist?
Yeah.
I never knew that. That was so hugely, that brings back all kinds of memories. It was so hugely popular back in the day. So good. That means our viewers can go ahead and take a look at that and kind of see, what it looks like. I'm sure it's pretty hard to tell probably from just looking at a page whether it was developed with Nanoc or with, a standard CMS or something like that.
Yeah, I actually think that it's impossible to tell The standard Nanoc site, if you generate a new site, it has this, what do you call it, this directory structure with a sample HTML file in it, with a sample style sheet in it, and the HTML files has a meta tag, a meta generator tag in it that says made with Nanoc, but that's about it. And most people remove that, sadly.
Right. Now, how do you handle dynamic content, though? I'm kind of curious. I mean, if and maybe because we were oversimplifying for terms of explanation here, but how do you handle dynamic content if it's a static? If it generates a static HTML page, how much programmability is there to be had?
Do you mean dynamic stuff at the client side or at the server side?
Yeah, I'm thinking more like on the server side. Like, trying to think of a good explanation. Like maybe
something like comments, maybe. Yeah,
comments or certain things that I might put up to say, like, if this is a certain user or if this is a certain if someone is connecting from this domain, maybe show them this. I'm thinking about things like ads and various things where, in PHP, it gives me a little bit of flexibility because I can put in variables and I can script around certain circumstances and kind of dynamically change things for an individual user or viewer that way, as opposed to having to hard code everything in. Either in Apache config files or whatever. So I'm just kind of curious: is there something that Nanoc does to help with that?
Well, you end up basically with static HTML pages, and it is possible to output PHP as well. That's easy, and then you can let Nanoc generate PHP files. That's something the Mist Online site does. If you arrive at the homepage, it scans the HTTP headers for the languages, and it redirects to the appropriate language, so English or Dutch or whatever. And there are people who run blogs with Nanoc, and they have comments, and usually that's done with Discus or something similar.
Right. So it's kind of like a script. That you would plug into the HTML, some sort of script, declaring a script in the middle of your HTML or in the header of your HTML.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in general, people don't really build dynamic sites in the way they would do with PHP.
Right. So how did you get started in this? How long have you been working on it, and how did this whole project get started?
It started about 5 years ago, and around that time, I was thinking about moving away from PHP. I was using WordPress, I think, but I didn't really like it much, and I was using Ruby, which is a really nice language, and I wanted to use it for my blog as well. And at the time, I was using a VPS, which is a virtual server, and it had 128 megabytes of RAM, and running Ruby on that really wasn't possible because of the limitations, speed-wise and memory-wise. And I really, really wanted to use Ruby, and so that's when Nanoc was born. Actually, it comes from an idea from a friend who wrote a couple of scripts for generating HTML files, and I thought, well, I can do this better, and then Nanoc was born.
Right. So scratching your own itch, as is the case with so many open source projects. So you were the one that started this, and how long have you been working on it?
Nanoc is exactly 5 years and 1 day old. So yesterday was its fifth birthday.
Oh, happy birthday.
I didn't have cake.
A virtual cake. That's great. So I'm just trying to think who else is using this. I mean, you mentioned the Mist website that we talked about earlier. Do you know of other people who are using this? And what is I'm assuming the primary benefit here is the server load, but who else is using this?
There's on the Nanoc wiki, there's a showcase which lists quite a few sites that are built with it. But some of the more important sites are the GitHub developer resources, for example. They use Nanoc for their API documentation. Flutter does too. There is an Ugly Betty site built with Nanoc. I'm not sure whether the show went live, but that's quite nice to have.
Oh, yeah. It's been on the air for, I don't know if it's still on the air, but it's been on the air for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Danny, I'm interested. You mentioned it was the 5th birthday yesterday, 5-year birthday. But I also noticed when I was looking through your site today that you actually had a release today and version 3.3. I was wondering if that was a celebration of your appearance on FLOSS, or is it just a coincidence?
I had a few bug fixes lying around, and it was time to release, I suppose. I do bug fix releases quite often, or when it's necessary, actually, and it was today. So that's a coincidence, really.
No, that's okay. Now, I was just curious that when I went on there, it was on the sidebar. It popped up saying there was a new release today. So I'm curious about, I mean, I'm quite a fan of Python, as I've said before, much to Randall's dismay, I'm sure. But I know a lot of people are using Ruby on Rails and so on. But why did you choose to use Ruby to develop this site? Was it something that you were just already familiar with, or you liked the language?
Yeah, I'm really a fan of the language. It's very easy to get started with for new programmers as well. But if you want to build something from scratch and you want to prototype it, then Ruby is a really great choice, I think.
And is there many people working on it and many other contributors contributing? Because, I mean, Ruby is a very popular language right now. So are people putting patches in to the code and stuff as well?
Yeah, there are no active contributors, but there are people submitting patches or suggesting new features and writing implementations for those features sometimes. But it's mostly patches and small fixes that I get, and then I review them. Maybe I think twice. I think things through, and then eventually commit it into the repository. So it's still a bit of a dictatorship from my part.
Well, I was just going to say that puts a lot of burden on you to keep it all going then. So does it not get a bit much sometimes when there's people screaming for new features and you think, oh, if only someone else could help out with this?
Yeah, and Nanoc is at a point in its life where there are no easy features to add anymore. There are features, there are enhancements, and all those enhancements really take much more thought. It's not just a quick new feature to be added, but these are features you really need to think through, and they are difficult to implement. Not just difficult to implement, but conceptually difficult. So it would be really great if I had someone, another contributor who is a bit like me, meaning that someone who can code and has commit rights and so on.
Yeah, definitely would lighten the load, I think, in the long run. But I'm curious about like what I need to run this, because on the server it's just going to be static files, so I'm not going to need anything particularly fancy. Any web server that can serve static files, which if it is a web server, it really should be able to do. Would do it on that end. So on my client end, do I just need can I just use any implementation of Ruby or anything special that I need to run Nanoc?
Yeah. On the server side, you just need a file server or a web server that can serve files, and you can configure a patch in such a way that it's not able to serve files. But on the client side, on your own computer, you need a Ruby installation. That can be Ruby 1.8, which is still quite widespread. It can be Ruby 1.9, which is a new version, which I recommend because it's faster. But there are alternative Ruby implementations as well, such as JRuby, and Nanoc works on that as well. There's Rubinius, it works on there as well. And there are probably others. There are other Ruby implementations, but I haven't really played around with them, but it should work. Nanoc should work on all Ruby implementations.
Yeah, you mentioned JRuby and some of the other implementations. So have you tested it out on those? Have you run it yourself on those, or is it just kind of reports that you're getting back from the community?
I should probably say that I test every release on every Ruby implementation, but that would be a lie. So usually it's just Ruby 1.8 and 1.9. I do test it on other implementations as well from time to time, but it's not actively. And I do get bug reports from other people, from users who use Ruby, JRuby, and they say, look, this isn't fixed.
Okay, so I'm curious about some of the other. There's a few other Ruby tools for doing similar things. So how would this compare to something like Jekyll, or Jekyll, I should say, which people might know, similar feature parity and so on?
Yeah, there are quite a few other implementations of similar systems. Jekyll is one of them. There are quite a few floating around. If you go to the Nanoc website, it's somewhere in the documentation, I think in the introduction chapter, you get a list of similar projects, and there are, I think, about 30 or so.
Wow.
And the main difference between Nanoc and the others is that Nanoc is really focused on being powerful, meaning that if you have an idea of a static site in your head and you want to build it, and it doesn't matter how complex it is, Nanoc will be able to handle it, or should be able to handle it. So that's unlike Jekyll, for example, Jekyll is easier to use, I believe. I haven't actually used it. And it's Octopress is built on top of it. So Octopress is quite popular as well. It comes with a pre-built template. With integration with Twitter and whatever. So if someone would want to start his own blog, then Octopress would be a nice choice to begin with, but you will lack the extra features or the extra power that Nanoc gives you. So that's
Sorry, I was just going to say, you mentioned that there are so many other similar kind of tools like this in Ruby. Do you think it's something about Ruby that lends itself to this, or is it just really fashionable among people who like to write these kind of tools?
I think it's fashionable these days, and I'm not sure why. Back 5 years ago, there was only one tool I can think of that was Hobix, written by Y the Lucky Stiff, and the website was so strange and so alien that if you had no idea what Hobix was and you arrived on the site, then you would have no idea what the hell Hobix was. So Nanoc was, I think, the first tool that was understandable. And these days it's a bit of a hype. I see a lot of posts on Hacker News, for instance, people who say, look, I've written my own static site generator for this and for that, and it's most of them are focused at being very simple, doing one thing very well. So that's where that's quite different from Nanoc there.
And when I started web development and stuff years ago, back in university, when we were doing PHP and even Java and JSP and stuff like that, it seemed at the time as though everybody had to write a CMS. That was like the thing that you did. You learned a language like PHP and then you wrote your own CMS. So I'm wondering if maybe people are learning Ruby now and writing a static site generator instead. Maybe it's the new CMS. That's a way that it works on a number of levels, I think, that comparison. So I'm curious about the process of how you go about creating a site. So you get Nanoc installed, with your version of Ruby, etc., on your own machine, and then I had a look through documentation. You can run some commands to generate a blank site, if you like. But can you take us a bit through the process of how it works? Because I'm curious about things like filters and rules and so on, and how these are applied as it goes through.
Okay, so you create a site by executing the create site command, and then you end up with a directory which has a few subdirectories, one for content. Your actual pages go in there, your home page, your about page, your blog articles, and so on. Then there's the layouts directory in which you put your layouts, and a layout is basically an HTML page with a little hole in it where your content goes. So it contains your header and your footer and your sidebar and so on. And that's the first thing Nanoc does. The first feature, perhaps the most important one, is it combines the content with your layout. Now, if you want to write your pages in Markdown or Textile or so, you can do that. The conversion from Markdown to HTML is done using what is called filters. So you can chain filters together, and you can then execute a layout, and then execute even more filters, and then maybe another layout, and so on. But usually it's much simpler than that. So, for example, for my own site or the Nanoc site, I have Markdown. I use also ERB, that's the embedded Ruby. That's smaller than % equals, and then a bit of Ruby code, and then % and greater than for executing Ruby code, a bit like PHP. It sounds very vague if you can't, if you don't have a visual image for that. The Nanoc site also has filters for minifying the CSS and the JavaScript, although, no, not JavaScript, that's already minified, that's jQuery, I think. And there are other filters as well for Sass, for the CSS language, the other CSS-like language. There's a filter for modifying all paths in your site to make them relative, and so on and so on. And it's very easy to write your own filter as well. So if you come up with some kind of Markdown variant and you would really like Nanoc to support it, then that's really easy to write your own filter. Subclass Nanoc filter and override the run method.
Excellent. So, I mean, it sounds like it's quite, I don't know what the word is now, highly configurable. I'm going to say, I don't know if that's a word, but it is now. So it sounds like you can really get in at quite a low level and change things around. And I'm curious because the way it works, it's all, I kind of come at this from a world of, CMS is really that I'm very used to. So I'm used to the data being in a database and all that, and then it's just about grabbing it out. But this, it seems, is a little bit different because what you're doing is building a final product, and you can spend a lot of time, finally going over each area and so on, because you're not going to be serving that request every time a request comes in. You're not serving it like you would be with a normal dynamic web application. So you're just doing it once. Does that lend any kind of extra power, do you think? I mean, I know it'll be faster because it's static, but does that give you more time to kind of think about the logic of how it goes through and change things more at a fine-grained level, as you're compiling it, if you like?
I think that while you're working on a site, you're more inclined to change things and experiment things, because when you compile, the end result will not be on your server, but it will be on your laptop or your desktop, and you can inspect the files there to see if it's okay, so you can experiment and change and change even more. And if you're happy with the result, then you can publish your site.
And I was curious about, it says in the documentation there, you were talking about some of the outputs that you can get from Nanoc, and obviously most people are going to generate a HTML site, but can people use it for other things? Could they use it to make like a document for printing or something like that, or something else? Does it have to produce HTML, or could you maybe repurpose it to do some kind of desktop publishing almost type thing and formatting of like a book or so on?
Yeah, Nanoc is certainly not limited to HTML. It can also generate, for example, PHP. That's quite similar, but Nanoc has support for managing assets, and by assets I mean JavaScript files, CSS files, but also images. And you could even use it to manage a video library and transcode your videos, but that's not really recommended, because it will have to recompile a bit too often. But it's also possible to generate PDFs. I haven't really played around with that yet, but it's certainly possible. And the most strange thing I've ever done with Nanoc, and it wasn't pretty, was use it as a replacement for make for my C source code. So I had my C source code in my content directory, and I set up my rules. And then there was the executable in my output directory. I don't recommend using it that way, but it's nice to know that it works that way.
I was just going to say, so it did work then. It did actually compile for you.
Yeah, but the code wasn't pretty, believe me.
Oh, that is very cool. So, yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about, I mean, what about the rules and so on? Because I've been reading about rules and how you can write these rules and so on to structure like where the output will go. So you mentioned about the, making, if you've got, I don't know, a blog, so you might want to have everything to be /post/ whatever the post is. You can get it to do that with things like rules and so on. You can tell the output where you want it to go in a structured kind of way. So how does all that work?
Yeah, so there's two kinds of rules. There's a rule that says for every file in my content directory, I want it to be written with that specific path to my output directory. So, for example, if you have a loose collection of blog articles in your content directory and they have attributes like posted on, which is a date, then you can write a routing rule that says I want it to be written to my output directory, and I want to have the publication date in the URL, in the path name, so that's possible. And the second kind of rule is a compilation rule, and the compilation rule includes the list of filters that you want to run, the layout that you want to run, and so on. And the rule is there's like make files. You can tell that this rule matches every blog article, or this rule matches every article except the blog, every page except the blog articles. And you can have special rules for your images or for your CSS or your JavaScript and so on.
So it sounds like there's a couple more. As I'm listening to you guys talking about this, I'm just kind of thinking about some of the advantages here. It sounds like there's two other ones besides just the performance of your server. The first one sounds like compatibility, in that if I've got a server farm, I could have different versions of PHP. I could have different versions of Drupal running. I could have different, whatever I'm using, WordPress. There might be, changes in WordPress or something. But it sounds like if one of the advantages here is that if I use this, then I'm pretty much guaranteed that as long as my Apache configuration, is the same. Of course, this depends on what you're doing on your server, I know, but just in general, as long as some basic things are the same on your server, on all your servers, then you're going to be able to push this out and run it in multiple places, maybe without having to worry so much about compatibility issues. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. Once your site is compiled, then you just have the HTML files, the CSS, JavaScripts, whatever, and then you can host it everywhere, and you don't have to worry about compatibility.
Right.
There is compatibility issues at the client side, of course. If you work on a team on the same website, you have to make sure that you use the latest versions of all the libraries that you're using. But that's not much of a problem. There's a bundler for Ruby. People use it a lot. So you stick a gem file in your Nanoc projects and you describe which gems you want, and then you can just install all of them.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, it seems like if I had a team of developers, like I said, in a large server farm where these files were going to live with, it just seems like this cuts back on the complexity quite a bit. Again, maybe not a concern for just, one person with one website on one server. But if you're a team of people, having something that produces consistent output in this case without having to worry about as many dependencies is kind of good. The other thing that I was thinking as you guys were talking is this seems to also benefit in terms of security So, a lot of times there'll be, one of the things I struggle with Drupal, or thinking about running my own WordPress server or something like that as well. I'm busy. It's not like I do, pay attention to my website. It was down all last week while I was out of town. I couldn't do anything to fix it, unfortunately. But, I don't pay attention to it that much. But, if I was, for example, if a new version of Drupal came out with some security bugs, or a new version of WordPress, or for that matter, a new version of PHP, or any of the other dependencies that you might have in a dynamically generated site, that could be a problem. But with this, it seems like that takes away a lot of that concern about security issues on, in the various other components that you would typically use to build a website.
Yeah, it's true. And it's also, there are no security releases for Nanoc, and I don't have to worry about when I add a new feature, I don't have to worry about security. Is this safe? Can this be abused? That's just not relevant for Nanoc.
Interesting. So one of the other things I wanted to get to before we get too far in here is, is this something you do full time? Do you have another job? I mean, is this something that's making money for you?
This is a hobby project. I do have a full-time job, so I work on Nanoc in my free time, which is a bit sparse at times. So I would actually like to spend more time working on Nanoc, but that's difficult.
So if there was a Red Hat or another company that wanted to sponsor this, you would be open to that, it sounds like.
Yeah, sure.
So you're not doing any kind of like support or anything like that, to make a few extra dollars on the side yet?
No, I do lend support to people who ask it, but that's free. People like that, of course, but sometimes the amount of messages on the Nanoc mailing list is so huge. Well, it's not actually that huge, but you need time for it, and you need to make time for it, and sometimes that's difficult.
Right. Now, since this is developed in Ruby, what kind of license are you generally using for this?
I'm using the MIT license. I don't really think that anybody should be prevented from using it because of the license. So the MIT is as open as possible, and everyone is free to use it, as long as they give me attribution, of course. But of course, the sites that you build with Nanoc can be under any license. That's a bit like GCC. It's not because you write something with GCC that you have to use the GPL for the programs that you compile with it. Right.
The other question I had is, you mentioned you were looking for some help in certain areas. I guess this is a two-part question. Are there any areas in particular that you're looking for help with? And also, is there forgot the second part of my question. There's two parts here. No, the first part is, are there any certain areas that you're looking for help with? And I guess the follow-on to that is what's coming next? I mean, you just had a release today, which is cool, but what kind of things are you working on in the future?
I have quite a few plans for the future. One thing that keeps coming up is that people don't want to use the command line interface anymore, or perhaps less. And these people are I think someone said secretaries and PR people, so companies that have a site and they want to do it in Nanoc because it's a nice tool, but there are people responsible for the content that really don't know how to use a command line interface, have no idea what Ruby is, and if Nanoc crashes, they get a stack trace, and they don't know what to do with that. So one of the big projects I have in mind is some kind of a graphical user interface on top of Nanoc. I have some ideas there, but I would certainly like to investigate that and find some time to work on that. But in order to finish that, I will need way more time, and I will need people who can help me there, coding, documentation, ideas, all sort of stuff. So if anybody out there using Nanoc is interested in such a thing, a web-based interface for managing content to be compiled with Nanoc, please let me know.
That's interesting. So you're obviously getting a lot of users beyond the I don't know how to call it, the kind of the developer or the technical user, and that presents you with a lot more challenges and so on. So you're looking at actually building in a way of controlling the content inside of the site. Will that not mitigate some of the advantages you have in not running code on the server and so on, and some of the speed advantages? Because presumably you'll have to somehow run the code on the server to achieve that.
Yeah, but I think that such a user interface would perhaps be part of a private intranet, and it would have this compile button, and it would compile to an internal staging site that you can investigate and check whether everything is okay, and you have this big publish button that actually publishes the site live. So yes, there are disadvantages to running it that way. You will need a server that has Ruby installed and all the different gems and the compatibility issues maybe. But I think that the final result will be a static HTML page, a static HTML site, then people won't really notice. That's not really relevant, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I'm curious about, just to kind of jump back almost a little bit, we talked about the whole display stuff and the fact that you can make yourself a template and all that. Now, a lot of these kind of web applications, like although they're slightly different, things like WordPress and so on, there's massive communities of people making themes and so on for them. Why doesn't Nanoc come with any themes? Is that because it's down to you to have to make them all as well? Is that another layer of stuff that you'd have to deal with?
Yeah, people who use Nanoc have to create their own themes. And I have been playing around with making a few themes for Nanoc, but I think that would defeat the point of Nanoc. Nanoc is fairly bare bones, very flexible, but it's not meant to be a ready-made solution for creating a site, for creating your own blog or creating your own site. It's really aimed at being powerful, and it's not so much that you want to create a new site with Nanoc. I think that people want to take an existing site and convert it to Nanoc, and it's all about giving people the flexibility to use the design they want, use the templates they want. Nanoc makes no assumption about how your site is going to look like. That's why if you take a look at the Nanoc site, then you won't be able to tell that it's a Nanoc site.
And I read a lot of stuff, a lot of blog posts and so on from people who've moved from, and I'm not picking on WordPress, but a lot of them seem to mention WordPress, have moved from, for example, WordPress to a Nanoc site. Is there any easy way of doing that? Because with Nanoc, I'm going to have to generate the pages and so on. Is there any kind of tool I could use to maybe strip this content out of my WordPress site or database and then build like a Nanoc site with it?
There are no importers for other blog engines, sadly. There has been some work on that. That's maybe something we can work on in the future. There are some implementations that could be reused. I actually have an interesting idea, and also quite crazy probably. That is, if you have your WordPress site, you could let Nanoc compile that, and with some kind of Ruby PHP bridge, you would be able to just use your existing Ruby WordPress site and your existing WordPress database and let Nanoc generate HTML files. I don't know if that's possible, but it looks possible, and it would be quite awesome to be able to do that. That's not really practical, but that's maybe another demonstration of the power of Nanoc, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you can really almost output anything with it, which is amazingly powerful, as you say. And I've got one more kind of slightly strange question that came into my head. Now, when I think about compiling and so on, I think of GCC and compiling C and the amount of processing and stuff that takes. So how long, say if I had a site with, I don't know, 100 pages or 200 pages, how long would it take to kind of compile? I know this is all relative to if I've got a really fast computer and so on, but is it any way comparable to the amount of time it would take me to, say, compile a C program or something, or is it much quicker?
I think that you can count on half a second per page, depending on the amount of filters. If you're just writing HTML and you want to combine it with a layout that's also just HTML, then of course your pages will be compiled quite quickly. If, on the other hand, you have Markdown and you have some kind of smarty pants-like processor that makes your typography look nice, smart codes and so on, and you use Haml and you use, I don't know, whatever other filters out there, then of course these pages are going to be compiled slower. There are people using Nanoc with a few thousand pages, and I think that takes about 10 minutes to compile the entire site. So that's quite some time. Of course, if you have a CMS that runs on your server, the pages will be compiled on the fly, and there will be only one page compiled when you request one page. But with Nanoc and with any static site generator, of course, you have to compile everything.
Yeah, so that could be a problem for people running very large sites that just have to make simple little changes, right?
Yeah, I think that's a problem that's inherent to static site generators. And Nanoc has some algorithms that check whether pages are outdated, and Nanoc tracks dependencies between pages. So if you compile your site and you've made only a few changes, chances are that only few pages will need to be recompiled. But the algorithms behind that aren't complete, and I think it's very, very, very difficult to get right 100%, but it will have to do for now.
Right. Maybe that can be an option. Compile, take the chance of compiling loosely, looking for pages that have changed, or, compile everything.
Yeah, well, Nanoc has, when you compile a Nanoc site, then there's a guarantee that afterwards your compiled site will be up to date. And the algorithms that exist, if they are 100% sure that one specific page doesn't need to be recompiled, then it won't. But if it's not entirely sure, due to dependencies or whatever, that a page maybe needs to be recompiled or maybe not, then it will be recompiled. So Nanoc focuses on being correct instead of speedy here.
Right. So I've got a couple quick final questions. We're about out of time. One is, Dan mentioned previously databases. I'm just wondering, for example, the reason I started using Perl a long time ago was to actually generate web pages, but interfacing with the database. So is that possible with Nanoc?
Nanoc has this concept called data sources, and usually Nanoc reads files from the file system, from your disk, but it's also possible to write a data source that extracts your items and your layouts from a database. There is a active record demonstration repository on my GitHub account that demonstrates how you would use active records from Rails with Nanoc. So it's certainly possible to use a database as well.
Okay. So where can people go to either find out more information about this, or if they want to start contributing, what's the best place for them to go?
There's the website, nanoc.stoneship.org, or just Google for Nanoc, There is an IRC channel if you want some real-time chat. There's quite a few people in there. There's the mailing list, also quite useful. It's all linked from the site. And if you want to submit patches or report issues, then GitHub is the place to be.
Okay. And if people want to try this out and they have questions, mailing list may be the best place, or IRC to get immediate, or somewhat immediate feedback. Maybe someone else has had the same problem already.
Yeah, go on IRC, come on to the IRC channel, and if there's no feedback, go to the mailing list, and you will certainly get a response.
Okay. Great. And last question of the day, which I would be remiss if I did not ask, and Randall would not be happy. VI or Emacs?
I actually am between TextMate and Vim. Mm-hmm. It's quite difficult to be between text editors, but I've been instructed to say Emacs, so Emacs.
Someone's gunning for you if you don't say Emacs. That's funny. Great. Well, Denis, thank you very much for coming on the show today. This has been a very interesting show. I hadn't heard of this project before, and I think it's awesome that you are doing this basically, one-man show with some contributions, of course. We don't want to leave those people out, but, basically a one-person maintainer of a project like this is no small undertaking. So thanks for coming on and telling everybody about it. It's been great to talk to you.
It's my pleasure. All
right. Thanks very much. That was Denis Defreyne. I think I said that close to right. Probably not. I probably butchered it. But so I'm kind of curious to get your take on this, Dan, because I know you've done a lot of web development work, and you've dealt with Drupal and things like that in the past. So you're no stranger to this. What do you think?
It's certainly a different way of developing a website. I mean, it kind of turns the whole thing on its head. I mean, as I was saying, when I first started looking at this, couple of days ago when I was reading about this show, it kind of, I had to change my whole mindset, because I come from a kind of model view controller kind of world where you do, that's what you do in your websites. You go in a database, you get the data, you build a page, you give it to the person. So this is really a whole different way of doing it, and I can see actually for a lot of sites they probably would be better off, because there's a lot of sites that don't need more than a few pages, and yet they still choose to use something like WordPress or something, and maybe they don't need to, and they could just build it out like this and use more efficient web hosting as well, which is quite an interesting advantage of it.
Right, a lot of unnecessary overhead a lot of times.
Yeah. It certainly seems like it.
Yeah. Well, this kind of reminds me. I mean, I've dealt with problems like this before. When I mentioned using Perl and learning Perl to do web pages, one of the issues that I ran into, and this made me think of the compatibility thing, is that I was writing Perl scripts that I wanted to run everywhere in the environment I was working in, and there was servers out there still running Perl 4, might be various versions of Perl 5, and it was just kind of crazy to try to I was using lots of different libraries and things in my Perl scripts, and different modules, and those weren't available necessarily. I went through rounds and rounds of trying to get this to run on several servers, and finally I just said, you know what, forget it. I'm going to find a compiler. So I found a compiler that would compile into a binary that I could just run, and it would include all the modules and everything. And then I just pushed that file out to all the servers, and it ran, of course, because everything was included in the binary that it needed. So, I mean, I can certainly see for compatibility, if people are working in environments where they have, lots of different maybe versions of PHP on their servers, and they just want to have something that runs, they know will run pretty much anywhere, given a few low-level requirements. I think this is a really good choice to go out and do this. And also it provides, a consistent way for, someone that's making changes but doesn't necessarily know what the layout's going to be, or maybe there's someone that's in charge of layout design and someone else that's in charge of content, for example. They don't want to mess with the layout, so that's already kind of done for you. All you have to do is go change your whatever file, whatever format you're working in. You go change that information. They don't have to worry about messing up the layout of the site and things like that. So that seems like a pretty interesting project.
Yeah, one of the main barriers that I can see at the moment for it would be end users. I mean, people who are not technical. It sounds like Denis has already encountered that. And there's a lot of sites right now where somebody in the company who's maybe not so technical will be in charge of adding news items to the website or something like that. So it sounds like he's already thinking about that already, but I think that could be a big challenge to maybe more mainstream adoption for those kind of companies where somebody needs to be able to just open a text box, type something in, and go for it.
Right. Well, I think he's definitely thinking about his user base, and we're also thinking about our user base continually. And to that end, we have some upcoming shows to tell you about. How was that for a transition?
Smooth.
That's horrible. So a couple interesting shows I just want to point out as we're wrapping up here. First of all, no show next week. So NAB is going on, and there's going to be some special broadcasts here on the TWiT network. So there's no Floss next week. Take it as a good opportunity to go out and download some of the shows that you've missed and listen to those next week at the normal time. You can pretend that you're live with us, even though you won't be. But definitely go out and check out some old episodes during next week's time slot. And then coming up on April 25th, I think Randall will be back. He's on a cruise this week. That's why he's not here. He will be back, I believe. Maybe not. But Liz Quilty will be on the show, and she's a technologist from New Zealand and someone that has given me lots of grief in the past online about some of my some of the things that I've said that are technically incorrect. So I know she'll be a really good guest, really interesting. And then on May 2nd, Art Cancro, probably mispronouncing his name, is going to be on to talk about Citadel, which is groupware collaboration, open source groupware collaboration. So that should be interesting. And then on May 9th, Sean Schofield comes on to talk about Spree Commerce, which is open source e-commerce. So a lot of people getting into using open source to kind of break into the enterprise type application environments. And so we've got a lot of those guests coming up on the show. So it should be very interesting and should provide some good alternatives for folks out there using other perhaps proprietary software to get their business done. Maybe they can take a look at some of these applications and start using open source in their environments. Real quickly to wrap up here, as far as I'm concerned, I will be on All About Android coming up on April 30th and May 13th, I believe. So those are tentative dates, but I believe I will be on All About Android, which appears Monday on the TWiT network. Also, a reminder that Maker Faire is coming up. So if you're in the Bay Area Maker Faire, which is down in San Mateo, is coming up on May 19th and 20th. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as you're out and about. I will be there as well. So look for me there, or send me a message if you want to hook up at Maker Faire. I will be there definitely. Also, if you want to follow this show more closely, definitely take a look at Floss Weekly on Twitter and Identica. You can also add Floss Weekly to your circles. There's a Floss Weekly page on Google+. So if you're a Google+ user, definitely add Floss Weekly. That's where actually a lot of the news comes out, and I know I'm a big Floss Weekly user. You can also join us live at if you want to chat with us during the show, or with anybody here actually for any of the shows, you can go to irc.twit.tv, or you can watch live at live.twit.tv. You can also follow me. I am Aaron Newcomb on Facebook, Twitter, and like I said, Aaron Newcomb on Google+ is the best way to get a hold of me. So if you're or just go to aaronnewcomb.com, you can kind of see everything that's going on if you want to do that. Okay, enough plugging for me. I won't even mention my show. I'm just going to go right to Dan and let him plug away.
Thank you very much. I'd like to encourage people to take a look at Linux Outlaws, which is one of the show I co-host with my co-host in Germany, Fabian, and we talk about all of the kind of open source and Linux news from the week, really, and we try and keep it on top of all that, which is always a challenge with the open source world because things move so quickly. So you can find out more about that if you you can search for it, Linux Outlaws. It comes up all over the place. If you want to find out more about what I'm up to kind of more personally, my blog, stuff like that, music, all of that, you can go to danlynch.org, and you can find all of my links for Twitter and Google Plus and stuff like that. The problem with Google Plus, as you were just mentioning, is the fact that it makes you use your real name, and there are millions of people called Dan Lynch in the world. It's a very popular name. So if you're looking for me on Google Plus, your best bet is probably to go to danlynch.org and click the link, or look for a picture of a guy holding a guitar and wearing a red hat, and then you never know, that might be me, unless there's another Dan Lynch with a red hat and a guitar. So I think that's it. Yeah, just go and have a look at that, and you can find out all about what's going on there. And keep an eye. I'll mention this as time goes on, but we just announced that we're going to run another OggCamp event, which is the annual event that we run in conjunction with some guys at the Ubuntu UK podcast. And we get like 300-400 people together to do a bit of a bar camp style event. and talk about technology, get interesting guests. It's coming up later in the year. It's going to be August the 18th and the 19th. It's in Liverpool, which is local for me, which is great. And you can find out more at oggcamp.org, oggcamp.org. And I think that's enough plugs for me as well.
Well, that's awesome. I love OggCamp. I think it's such a great event. So good luck with that. It should be really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the biggest. I always forget to say this. I'm not a marketing guy, you can tell. It's the biggest Linux and free software event in the UK these days.
There you go. Definitely check it out. All right. Well, that'll wrap it up for another great edition of Floss Weekly. Dan, thanks so much for joining me. It was always fun to talk with you, and you always have such great questions. So thanks for co-hosting with me today.
No problem. It's always a pleasure to co-host.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Great. Well, thanks again. Join us next week, and we will be talking to you yet again on Floss Weekly.